In 1997, the town of Northwood was told that 17-year-old Amelia Vance had vanished without a trace. They were wrong. They're a trace. One small piece of her life, kept as a secret trophy for 26 years. It wasn't found buried in the deep woods or at the bottom of a cold lake. It was found here, inside the wall of a maximum security prison. The chilling discovery wouldn't just reveal what happened to Amelia, it would expose a monster who had been hiding in plain sight all along. What police would uncover would not only solve a case everyone thought was frozen in time, but reveal a truth far more disturbing than anyone imagined. October in Northwood, Oregon, always felt like a promise and a warning. The maple trees that lined the suburban streets would set themselves on fire with color, a final brilliant act of defiance before the long gray rain of winter began. For 17-year-old Amelia Vance, Mia to everyone who knew her, it was a season of possibility. High school was almost over. The rest of her life was a blank canvas, waiting for the first stroke of paint. Her world was contained inside the four walls of her bedroom. It was a universe of her own making, a creative chaos of art supplies, books, and posters of bands like Pearl Jam and the Cranberries taped to the walls. On the afternoon of October 24, 1997, Mia was on the floor, hunched over a large sketchbook. Her hair fell across her face, the tips of her fingers were smudged black with charcoal, and the tinny buzz of music from her Walkman was the only sound in her self-contained world. The door opened, and her older sister, Clara, entered. At 22, Clara was the image of practicality, a stark contrast to Mia's artistic disarray. She carried a basket of clean laundry and surveyed the room with an amused smile. She told Mia the room was a fire hazard, that one spark could send her entire artistic legacy up in smoke. Mia pulled off her headphones, momentarily filling the room with the sound of a guitar riff before she pressed the stop button. It was an atmosphere, she insisted. Something an artist needed. She teased that Clara, who lived her life in spreadsheets, wouldn't understand. Clara placed the laundry on the bed and reminded her that it was those spreadsheets that paid the bills and kept her atmosphere warm. She then shared the news she'd been holding on to. She'd spoken to their mother. If Mia's grades stayed up, their mom would help with the application fee for the Portland Art Institute. The news lit up Mia's face with a pure, explosive joy, the kind of hope that only a 17-year-old on the cusp of her dreams can feel. "Seriously?" she asked, her voice full of disbelief. "Oh my God, Clara, seriously?" Clara confirmed it, but added the condition: less time sketching and more time with her history textbook for the big test on Monday. Mia agreed, saying she was heading to the library to study in the quiet, away from distractions. As Clara sat on the bed, she picked up one of Mia's sketchbooks and flipped through the pages, filled with faces, landscapes, and detailed studies of birds' wings. She fondly recalled the time a 10-year-old Mia had tried to sketch a bird's nest, only to have it fall on her head, leaving twigs in her hair for 3 days. Mia laughed, defending it as a noble sacrifice for science. It was a simple moment, an easy exchange between sisters, the kind that is usually forgotten. But for Clara, every detail of this conversation would soon be replayed in her mind, a sacred relic from the last moments of her normal life. Mia stood up, packed her sketchbook into a backpack, already heavy with books, and headed for the door, telling Clara not to wait on dinner if she got into her study zone. Clara reminded her that dinner was at 7, and she'd eat Mia's portion if she was late. With a final smiling "see you later," Mia was gone. Clara heard her footsteps on the stairs, the sound of the front door opening and closing, and then the house settled into quiet. At first, the quiet was normal, but as the clock on the VCR in the living room ticked past 7, then 7:30, the silence began to change. It grew heavier. It started to have a shape. Clara was on the sofa, the blue light of the television flickering across her face, though her eyes kept drifting to the telephone on the end table. In the kitchen, 2 plates of food sat on the table, one of them untouched. The initial feeling of annoyance, so typical when dealing with her often distracted sister, began to curdle into a low, quiet hum of worry. The library had closed at 7. Even if Mia had lost track of time, she should have been home. By 8 o'clock, the hum was becoming an alarm. Clara walked decisively to the phone and called the library. While she waited for an answer, her leg bounced with a nervous energy. She asked the librarian on the other end what time her sister, Mia Vance, had left that evening. The woman's answer was the first crack in the foundation of her world. Mia had signed out at 5:15, nearly 3 hours ago. The walk home took 20 minutes. Clara hung up the phone, the sound of the plastic receiver hitting its cradle unnaturally loud in the silent house. She grabbed the phone book, her hands trembling, as she began a frantic ritual of calls to Mia's friends. Each conversation was the same. She would start by trying to keep her voice steady, asking if Mia was there. And with each no, the possibilities narrowed. She wasn't at the library. She wasn't with friends. She wasn't anywhere she was supposed to be. The logical, orderly world Clara inhabited was dissolving into a terrifying chaos. The untouched plate on the kitchen table now seemed like a monument to her absence. There was only one call left to make. Her hand hovered over the phone, the receiver feeling impossibly heavy. This one call, she knew instinctively, would divide her life into 2 parts, everything before and everything after. She picked it up and dialed 911. When the calm, professional voice of the operator answered, Clara's own voice was a fragile, broken whisper. She reported that her sister, Amelia Vance, had not come home. That first night bled into a surreal morning. The Vance home, once a private sanctuary, became a stage for a slow, procedural nightmare. Uniformed officers moved through the rooms, their questions clinical, their presence an intrusion. Clara found herself recounting the previous day's events over and over, the details becoming smoother and more detached with each repetition, as if she were telling someone else's story. She was introduced to Detective Miller, a man near retirement, whose tired eyes seemed to have already settled on a conclusion. He listened patiently as Clara described Mia's dreams of art school, her dedication, her stable and happy life. She insisted that Mia would never run away. The detective nodded, his expression a mask of professional sympathy, but his questions pointed in a different direction. He asked about boyfriends, arguments with friends, any secret troubles Mia might have had. To him, a 17-year-old girl who disappears on a Friday night fits a particular narrative, one he had seen play out many times before. In the days that followed, this narrative became the official police theory, a quiet dismissal of Clara's certainty. The investigation felt passive, a waiting game for a runaway to return home on her own. For Clara, waiting was not an option. While the police waited, she acted. She emptied her savings account to print thousands of flyers. The smiling, slightly awkward photo from Mia's school ID, the very picture Mia had complained about, was now a symbol of hope. Clara walked for miles, her hands raw from the cold and the sticky tape, plastering her sister's face on every telephone pole, every coffee shop window, every community bulletin board in Northwood and the surrounding towns. Each flyer was a silent scream into the void, a desperate attempt to rewind time back to the moment before her sister stepped out the front door. Weeks turned into months. The autumn leaves that had carpeted the ground during Mia's disappearance were replaced by the stark, gray blanket of winter. The police calls became less frequent. The local news moved on to other stories. The flyers, battered by rain and snow, began to peel and fade, Mia's smile dissolving back into the landscape. The town's collective attention drifted, but Clara's focus only sharpened. The world moved on, but she remained fixed in those first few hours of uncertainty, a prisoner of a single, unanswered question. The years that followed were a long, barren desert of time. The tragedy reshaped Clara's life, forging her into someone new. She dropped her business courses and enrolled in a paralegal program. If the system of justice couldn't find the answers, she would learn its language, its rules, its secrets. She took a job at a small law firm in town, her life becoming a meticulous study in procedure and precedent. It was a way to channel her grief, to give her obsession a structure. She became known as quiet, intense, and ruthlessly organized. The milestones of Mia's stolen life became private, painful anniversaries for Clara. On the day Mia should have graduated from high school, Clara sat in her car across the street from the football field, watching the sea of caps and gowns, a hollow ache in her chest. On what would have been Mia's 21st birthday, Clara bought a small plain cupcake and let it sit on her kitchen counter until it grew stale, a bitter monument to a celebration that would never happen. She never spoke of these rituals to anyone. Her grief was a solitary, fiercely guarded thing. Decades passed. The world changed. Technology advanced, the town grew, and new families moved into the houses on her street. But for Clara, it was always 1997. About 10 years into the long wait, she filed a formal request and received a copy of Mia's entire case file. It was a thick, daunting stack of paper filled with dead-end leads, witness statements that went nowhere, and the cold, procedural language of a failed investigation. Over the years, she would read it again and again, as if the sheer force of her will could reveal a clue that everyone else had missed. And in a way, it did. Buried deep within the supplementary reports was a single, overlooked entry. It was a brief summary of an interview conducted with a security guard at the Northwood State Penitentiary. The prison's main wall bordered a public path that Mia sometimes used as a shortcut from the library. The guard, a man named Robert Finch, had been on duty in one of the towers that evening. He claimed he saw nothing out of the ordinary. The interviewing officer, however, had added a short handwritten note at the bottom of the page. It read, "Subject seemed oddly interested in the case, asked more questions than he answered, likely just a bored local." The lead was never pursued. It was a footnote in a sea of information, but the name, Finch, and the officer's casual observation snagged in Clara's mind. It was a single discordant note in a long, monotonous song of failure. She had no reason to focus on it, no evidence to support the cold feeling it gave her. It was just a ghost, a faint shadow in the periphery of the case, a name she would never forget. For 26 years, the silence surrounding Amelia Vance's disappearance was absolute. It was a cold, unmoving feature of the landscape in Northwood, a local tragedy that had long since settled into a sad, historical fact. Then, on a loud, dusty Tuesday in the summer of 2023, that silence was broken by the sound of a sledgehammer. The Northwood State Penitentiary was finally renovating its long decommissioned C block, a wing of the prison that hadn't housed an inmate since the late 1990s. The air was thick with the grit of pulverized plaster and the screech of rusting metal. For the demolition crew, it was just another day of monotonous, backbreaking work. A young worker named Leo was pulling down a section of crumbling drywall when he noticed something small tumble out with the debris. It was a dirty piece of plastic, no bigger than a credit card. He almost kicked it aside with his steel-toed boot, dismissing it as a piece of forgotten trash. But something made him pause. He picked it up and wiped the thick layer of dust away with his gloved thumb. Beneath the grime, a face stared back at him. It was a faded color photograph of a smiling, dark-haired girl, a school ID card. He had no idea how something like this could have ended up sealed inside a solid prison wall. He showed it to his supervisor, who, equally baffled, took it to the warden's office. An hour later, the strange object was placed in an evidence bag, and a call was made to the Northwood Police Department. The call was routed to the EHUM desk of Detective Rossi, a sharp, methodical investigator who had recently taken an interest in the department's cold cases. When she heard where the ID was found, she felt a prickle of professional curiosity. When she ran the name on the card, Amelia Vance, through the system, that curiosity ignited. The Vance case was a ghost in the department's archives, a file thick with dead ends and unanswered questions. Detective Rossi knew her next call would be a delicate one. She was about to disturb a piece that had been bought with more than 2 decades of pain. At a law office across town, Clara Vance was at her desk, her world a carefully managed ecosystem of legal briefs and case files. It was a life of order she had built to keep the chaos of her past at bay. When her phone rang displaying the name of the Northwood Police Department, her controlled world came to a sudden halt. She answered, her voice betraying none of the sudden tightness in her chest. Detective Rossi introduced herself and spoke in a calm, even tone. She explained that a construction crew at the state penitentiary had found something, an item, an old-school ID card belonging to Amelia. For Clara, the words seemed to come from a great distance. 26 years of disciplined grief, of forcing herself to accept the unknowable, had created a thick wall of scar tissue around her heart. In a single moment, Rossi's words shattered it. Hope, a feeling she had long since buried as too dangerous to feel, rushed back in with the force of a physical blow. It was a terrifying, agonizing sensation. The room seemed to tilt, and she had to grip the edge of her desk to keep steady. She listened in silence as the detective asked if she would be willing to come to the station. Later that day, the ID lay on a sterile cloth in an evidence room. To the naked eye, it was just a relic, a ghost from 1997. But under the advanced forensic tools available to Detective Rossi, it was something more. It was a map. The lab found what decades of searching could not. A partial, latent fingerprint, preserved in the lamination, that did not belong to Amelia Vance. And when Rossi carefully peeled back a faded band sticker that Mia had placed on the back of the card, she found another discovery, a name, or a nickname, written in tiny faded ink, almost invisible to the eye. It was one word, Finch. The discovery of that ID card in such an impossible place left investigators with more questions than answers. It's incredible how a single item hidden for a generation can rewrite history. The reopening of case file 97884, the official designation for the disappearance of Amelia Vance, was not a quiet affair. Detective Rossi assembled a small, dedicated team. Unlike the tired, overworked detectives of 1997 who had quickly yielded to the simplest explanation, Rossi's team operated with a new kind of energy. They worked under the bright fluorescent lights of a modern office, surrounded by networked computers and digital archives. The dusty, forgotten case file was digitized, its contents scanned and converted into searchable data. The ghost of the past had returned, but this time it was met with the full force of 21st century technology. Clara Vance walked into the Northwood Police Department for the first time in over 2 decades. The building itself had changed, but the scent of stale coffee and institutional cleaning supplies was timeless. She was led to a small private conference room where Detective Rossi was waiting. For 26 years, law enforcement had been a symbol of failure for Clara. She entered the room with a carefully constructed wall of skepticism, her posture rigid, her expression guarded. She was prepared for sympathetic platitudes and, ultimately, more disappointment. But Detective Rossi was different. She didn't treat Clara like a fragile relic of a bygone tragedy. She treated her like an expert. She spoke with a directness and respect that chipped away at Clara's defenses. Rossi slid a file across the table. Inside was a high-resolution photograph of Mia's school ID. Seeing her sister's 17-year-old face so clearly, frozen in time, was a visceral shock. Clara stared at the image, her breath catching in her throat. It was real. After all the years of memory and imagination, here was tangible proof of that final day. Rossi gave her a moment, then gently guided her through the initial findings. She explained that the forensics lab had isolated a partial fingerprint from the card's plastic lamination. The narrator would explain this process simply, how oils and amino acids from a person's touch can remain on a non-porous surface for an incredible length of time, and how modern imaging technology can enhance and lift a print that would have been invisible years ago. Rossi stated that this unknown print was currently being run through AFIS, the National Fingerprint Database, searching for a match. Then came the second discovery. Rossi pointed to a magnified image of the back of the ID card, showing the faint, almost ghostly writing that had been hidden under the sticker. The name, Finch. The word struck Clara with the force of an electric shock. It was not the name of a boyfriend or a classmate or anyone from Mia's known world. It was the name from the case file. The name from the handwritten note at the bottom of a forgotten report. The prison guard. A cold dread mingled with a strange and terrible sense of validation washed over her. For years she had wondered if she was paranoid, if her endless review of the file had made her see ghosts where there were none. But the ghost now had a name, and it had been there all along. She looked at Detective Rossi, and for the first time, the wall of skepticism crumbled completely. She told the detective about the note in the file, about the guard who was oddly interested in the case. The information landed with quiet gravity in the room. What had been a dismissed piece of trivia for a 1997 detective was, for Detective Rossi, the first critical piece of corroboration. It connected the object found inside the prison to a person who had worked inside the prison. The revelation was a pivotal moment for Clara. It shattered the theory she had tortured herself with for years. The faceless stranger, the crime of opportunity. The truth was potentially more sinister. The person who took Mia wasn't a phantom who appeared out of nowhere. He was a man with a name, a job, and a place in the community. He had been so close, hiding in the one place no one would ever think to look, watching the investigation unfold from a position of authority and silence. The search for Mia was no longer a hunt for a ghost in the fog. It was now the hunt for a man named Finch. The hunt for a ghost named Finch began, not with a chase, but with a quiet, meticulous excavation of the past. Detective Rossi's team descended into the county archives, a place of dusty boxes and the faint, sweet smell of decaying paper. They were looking for personnel files from the Northwood State Penitentiary, specifically from the years leading up to 1997. After days of methodical searching, they found him. A single aging manila folder contained a black and white photograph of a younger man with cold, unremarkable eyes, his hair neatly parted. His name was Robert Finch. He had retired from the Department of Corrections in 2015 and now lived a quiet life in a neighboring town. The detectives had a face and an address. The ghost was beginning to take on flesh and bone. Rossi met with Clara again, presenting her with the grainy photograph from the file. Clara studied the face of the young guard, searching for any flicker of recognition, any connection to Mia's world. There was nothing. He was a complete stranger. The realization was chilling. The man who had haunted her family for a quarter of a century was not a spurned lover or a rival classmate, but an unknown predator who had operated entirely from the shadows. Armed with this information, Rossi and another detective drove to the home of Robert Finch. It was a modest house on a quiet suburban street with a neatly manicured lawn and a bird bath near the front porch. The banality of the scene was a stark contrast to the darkness they suspected him of. Finch himself answered the door. He was older, softer, but the same cold eyes from the photograph remained. He was polite even, welcoming, inviting the detectives into his living room. He listened calmly as Rossi explained that they were following up on an old case, the disappearance of Amelia Vance. The name, he claimed, didn't ring a bell. He confirmed he had worked at the prison for 30 years, but shrugged and said that a lot had happened back then. His denial was flawless. It was not the flustered, angry denial of a guilty man caught off guard, but the calm, slightly weary dismissal of an old man being bothered with ancient history. He was a portrait of harmless obscurity. The detectives left with nothing but a confident, credible lie And for a moment, a seed of doubt was planted. Had they followed the wrong path? That doubt was compounded by news from the forensics lab. The initial search of the National Fingerprint Database, AFIS, had come back empty. The partial print from Mia's ID card had no match among the millions of prints on file. The investigation had suddenly hit two brick walls at once. The only person of interest had a rock-solid denial, and the only piece of physical evidence led nowhere. The momentum that had been building since the discovery of the ID came to a grinding halt. The ghost was threatening to fade back into the shadows. It was then that a junior detective, conducting a final, exhaustive background check on Finch, found the key. It wasn't buried in the past, it was a recent event. Just 3 months prior, Robert Finch had been arrested for a minor DUI. It was a small local infraction, but as part of his processing, a new pristine set of his fingerprints had been taken and were, due to bureaucratic delays, only just now being uploaded to the state and national systems. It was the aha moment the case desperately needed. Rossi immediately ordered a direct comparison, not a blind search of the massive database, but a one-to-one analysis between the latent print lifted from a dead girl's ID card and the fresh ink prints of the quiet retiree who claimed to remember nothing. The call from the forensics lab came an hour later. The lab technician was unequivocal. The partial print from Mia's ID, the invisible trace left by a killer 26 years ago, was a positive match to the right index finger of Robert Finch. Obert Finch's quiet suburban facade was shattered by a single, irrefutable piece of science, breaking the lie he had maintained for 26 years. The second time the detectives arrived at Robert Finch's house, they did not come to ask questions. They came with an arrest warrant. The suburban quiet of the street was broken by the silent flashing lights of the patrol cars. Finch answered the door with the same calm demeanor as before, but a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps or caution, crossed his face when he saw them. He was not invited into his living room this time. He was asked to step outside. Detective Rossi faced him on his own manicured lawn. She didn't raise her voice. She simply laid out the facts with the cold, hard precision of a surgeon. She spoke of the school ID, of the name hidden beneath a sticker, and finally of the fingerprint, a perfect and irrefutable match to his own. With each word, the mask of the harmless retiree began to disintegrate. The calm facade did not just crack, it violently shattered. The politeness in his eyes was replaced by a deep, venomous rage. His body tensed, and for the first time, the detective saw not a forgetful old man, but the predator he truly was. His denials were no longer calm or confident, but sharp and spitting, the desperate snarls of a cornered animal. In the sterile white interrogation room at the station, under the weight of the undeniable proof against him, Robert Finch finally confessed. And the full, sickening truth of what happened to Amelia Vance on that October evening in 1997 finally came to light. The narrator can now piece together the puzzle. Finch's life had been one of profound mediocrity and quiet resentment. From his guard tower at the prison, he had a clear view of the public path below. He watched people come and go, living lives he felt were more vibrant than his own. He saw Mia pass by regularly, and in his mind she ceased to be a person. She became a symbol, an object of pure, youthful innocence that he grew obsessed with possessing. On that particular day, he saw his opportunity. He left his post for a short time, intercepting her on the path. He used the authority of his uniform to seem trustworthy, perhaps warning her of a fictitious danger or offering her a ride as dusk began to fall. He led her to a secluded spot he knew well. There he revealed his true intentions. When Mia, frightened and confused, rejected him, she did not just reject a man, she shattered his pathetic fantasy of control. This rejection triggered a violent narcissistic rage. He could not stand to be seen as the small, insignificant man he was. In a final, brutal act of power, he silenced her forever. He took only one thing from her, the school ID. It was his trophy, a secret token of his victory. The next day, during a quiet moment on his shift, he sealed it within the wall of the prison. In his twisted mind, this was the perfect crime. He had entombed her memory inside the very walls of his own kingdom, a place of power and control, where he believed his secret would be kept forever. Across town, Clara Vance's phone rang. It was Detective Rossi. This time, the detective's voice was different. It was heavy, but resolute. She informed Clara that Robert Finch had been arrested and that he had confessed. As Rossi summarized the horrifying details of Mia's last moments, Clara sat in silence, letting the words wash over her. It was the moment she had spent her entire adult life waiting for and dreading in equal measure. The question that had defined her existence finally had an answer. There was no sense of triumph, no cry of victory. There was only the immense, crushing weight of the truth. The faceless monster that had haunted her dreams for 26 years now had a name and a pathetic, hateful motive. The end of uncertainty was not a release into peace, but an arrival at a terrible, brutal clarity. Her sister was gone, stolen by a man whose banal evil was almost impossible to comprehend. In the end, Robert Finch, the man who had hidden in plain sight for a quarter of a century, did not face a jury. In exchange for his full confession and to avoid a trial that would have forced Clara to relive every horrific detail, he agreed to a plea bargain. He led the investigators to a remote wooded area miles outside of Northwood, a place he had chosen for its isolation. There, after 26 years of being lost to the world, the remains of Amelia Vance were finally recovered. Robert Finch was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his name now forever linked to the girl he had tried to erase. He would spend the rest of his days within prison walls, a fitting end for a man who had used them to hide his monstrous secret. The funeral for Amelia Vance was held on a crisp autumn day, much like the one on which she had disappeared. The attendees were not the teenagers who had known her, but middle-aged men and women with children of their own, their faces etched with the memory of a friend who would remain forever 17. For Clara, the day was not one of sorrow alone. It was a day of profound and quiet release. For the first time, she was not mourning a ghost or a question mark. She was laying her sister to rest. Standing there, under the fiery canopy of the October leaves, she finally performed the last long-overdue act of a loving sister. She said goodbye. In the months that followed, the world for Clara began to slowly, subtly shift. The obsessive weight that had shaped her entire adult life was gone. The case files were closed. The endless searching was over. One day, she walked away from her job. As a paralegal, the purpose for which she had taken it now fulfilled. She began to rediscover the small pieces of a life she had put on hold. She visited an art museum, standing for a long time in front of the kinds of paintings Mia would have loved. She took long walks without a destination, no longer scanning faces in the crowd, but simply feeling the sun on her skin. The long, cold winter of her grief was finally over. It was not a sudden arrival into happiness, but the first tentative thaw of a long-awaited spring. The story of Amelia Vance did not end with a prison sentence and a quiet grave. The incredible circumstances of the case, a clue hidden for decades, solved only by a chance, recent entry into a police database, sent ripples through the state's justice system. It highlighted a critical flaw. Countless cold cases sat dormant, filled with forensic evidence that was never retested against new data. Spurred on by Clara's quiet advocacy, the state legislature passed a new protocol officially named Mia's Law. It mandated the regular automated cross-referencing of all forensic evidence from cold cases against the state's ever-growing databases. Amelia's tragic end became a powerful legacy, a tool that promised to give other families the answers she had to wait 26 years to receive. The story of Amelia Vance teaches us that no voice should be silenced forever. and that the search for truth, no matter how long, is a testament to the enduring power of love. If stories of justice like this are important to you, help our community grow.